The guy I tried to hurt for hurting my sister turned out to be my boss. As delicately as I could put it, I fucked up. I hit 25 about 4 weeks back. Over the last couple of weeks, I've done and learned a few things I never thought I would. At least not until a month ago. But my destiny messing up my life was old news to me. So it did not surprise me a bit when I walked into my office and found my nightmare standing in front of my cabin and staring at my name card on my office desk. I swallowed hard. I knew who he was even before anyone introduced us. It was obvious by the quality of his suit, his perfectly styled hair. It screamed money, and something that I could not relate with. It was only now that I noticed how tall and broad he was in frame, and how much that suited the slight frown on his handsome face. Was he some kind of Greek god? I couldn't help but wonder. Not because I saw him as one, but because I desperately needed a distraction from the inevitable confrontation. When he eventually shifted his attention to me, he probably tired from staring at my name card. One might have wondered how a skinny person like me could have done what I had done 9 days prior. He stalked his way to me. I swallowed again, hoping I would regain some sense and confidence in myself. But that wasn't going to happen, and the universe knew it. In fact, it felt like the universe was having a good laugh right in my face. Because the man hadn't even uttered a "you" before I lost my footing and slipped into unconsciousness. I felt a strong pair of arms around me, but technically, I was near death, so I didn't care. A stranger might have presumed I had some Cinderella complex. I'd probably tell him to shut the heck up and advise me on how to prevent the impending catastrophe. But before delving into what transpired after that, I had to revisit what triggered it all. 2 days prior to my 25th birthday, my older sister, Jessie, came to me in tears. Although my relationship with my sister had never been good, given our different personalities, her tears scared me to death. My brain immediately started imagining the worst, and I would have imagined and done worse if not for her speaking up. When I asked her what happened, she first asked if I could order some Chinese. Bemused but still curious and willing to help her, I did as was asked of me. It was as she was halfway through her meal, tears mixing with the food, that she finally revealed the reason for her tears. She told me she had been dating a guy in her company, and how he'd, after using her body, thrown her under the bus when someone new came into his life. But that wasn't all, she told me. He even got me fired, Kian, and now I have no job. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed even harder. This wasn't a new situation. Jessie always had troublesome relationships with men. Her breakups were almost always messy, and she rarely stayed with a guy for more than 5 months, maybe 6 at most. But Jessie claimed that this guy was the best, and she really wanted to marry him. But all was done for, and she didn't know what to do with her life. I was angry and upset on her behalf. I wasn't going to let any man hurt her, especially not a stranger. I asked for his name. She gave me one. Sullivan Redmond. And that's how I found myself in the washroom of a seedy bar with a Sullivan Redmond. The tiles were dirty and so were the mirrors. I was sure if I touched the wrong place, I would have to purify myself. Despite the less than ideal conditions, I didn't waver in my pursuit of what I'd come here for. My sister had revealed that Sullivan had an attraction to both guys and girls, and I intended to exploit that. Sullivan was easy, and that made my mission easier. We shared one look in the mirror before he jumped on me to kiss me, and I kissed him back to keep up the pretense. He was an impressive kisser, and I could still vividly recall the warmth of his breath against mine. However, convincing him to let me bind his hands wasn't too difficult. I told him it would be fun and that I knew how to make these things work. He seemed a little skeptical, but he was just as much excited, and an excited man rarely possessed a clear thought. It was hard to work around his bulky frame, but 5 minutes later, I had him exactly like I wanted him. As I caught my breath, I couldn't help but realize how out of shape I was. I pushed him into one of the stalls, and he left out a curse when he bumped into something. However, I paid no attention to his complaints. I locked the door behind him, turned off the washroom lights, and then walked out of there. As I dusted off my clothes, I knew it would be a hell of a lot of trouble for him now, and it shamed me. It filled me with such shame, I was sure I would burst into tears at any moment. There it was, my revenge for my sister. No matter how not classy and stupid it was, as much as I was ashamed and regretful for what I had done, I couldn't help but not feel sorry for a man who had used my sister so meanly. He deserved it. No respectable man hurts a woman, and he has done it. So yes, he deserved that. I reassured myself repeatedly in the days that followed. Unfortunately, before I could either move on from the incident or do something about it, I found the same Sullivan Redmond in front of my desk. The universe sure as hell had a thing for me. because what else would explain my life? Fast forward to the present, and I was rudely awoken by a sharp stinging slap to my cheek. I let out a small whine, but it didn't take me long to realize that I wasn't at home, and that certainly wasn't my mom's doing. I sat up, still feeling a bit groggy, but not as much when a particular face came into my view. Sullivan stood in front of me with his hands in his pockets. He stared down on me with disinterest and seemed to be calculating what to do with me. I tried to make myself appear smaller, but that was a near impossible task. I was cursed with a slight frame, but a tall height. It was really inconvenient. "Mr. Kian," Sullivan began, "please meet me in my cabin at 1. I swallowed and nodded my head. I did not even realize it was lunch break. Not a single employee would be on this floor. I was going to die. I moaned, "Yes, sir." I answered despite my worries. He nodded at me and then looked at my colleagues. "Make sure he's all right." They nodded. We all watched him leave with bated breaths. "What the heck?" one of them whispered. One might wonder why I felt so nervous around them, considering the anger I had felt towards him just weeks earlier. First, Sullivan, according to my sister, had been a senior employee at the company she worked for. For some reason, Sullivan was fired from his job, and he was compelled to return to his father's company. This very company. He was now my boss, holding the power to determine whether I'd make it through another month in my apartment or not. Second, my sister might have left out some details while wailing about another of her failed relationships. Apparently, she said, although he had broken her heart, he was still a kind man. And then Jessie confessed she made just as many mistakes as Sullivan did. She never did tell me what that mistake was, but she insisted what I had done was over the top. Even though it was her idea, she retaliated by saying that I was an adult and perfectly capable of analyzing a situation. I was upset at her, but there was nothing I could have done. Since then, I lived and survived in fear, and now he was here, and there was no way I could avoid him. So yes, my life was indeed great with a capital G. When 1 p.m. arrived, I crawled to his cabin. I knocked on the glass door and waited for his signal. Behind me, I could hear people slipping out for the break. In front of me stood the devil. Sullivan told me to wait 5 minutes, and then made me wait there for 15 minutes. Just as my soul seemed on the verge of departing my body, he asked me to come in. When I did, the room was draped in pin-drop silence. "So," he began after a few minutes, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, interlocking his fingers and resting his chin on them. It appeared as if I were talking to a teenager, and he was very, very amused. "Speak, Kian." I opened my mouth to make an effort to do the same, but he showed me a hand and asked me to sit down first. He reminded me that he was not a mean boss, and he respected all of his employees. "I am sorry," were my first words. If Jessie had given me some guidance on how to handle this, I might have had a better response. However, after throwing me to a wolf, she seemed to have little concern for me, not acting as an older sister should. I was left in the wolf's mercy and now bound to die all alone. I should have confronted you in a different way, but I'm not sure what egged me on to try that of all things. And he interrupted me and rolled up his shirt sleeve, revealing a nasty fresh cut on his forearm. It was red and raw, and I felt a surge of guilt welling up within me. I nearly broke down into tears. I didn't know he was that hurt. I sucked on my bottom lip and watched him as he carefully straightened his sleeve. "I'm not very upset," he finally began. "I am, however, curious." "What's that?" I asked and crossed my hand on my lap. "Why did you do that? I mean, you do not look like the kind of guy who's hurt someone. Are you perhaps homophobic? Are you violent towards them?" As he continued with his questions, I found myself staring at him in disbelief. I was gay, for goodness sake. I was anything but homophobic. However, I could see why he might have drawn that conclusion. After all, I had used the most vulnerable moment and attacked him without any explanation. It did not help that the situation wasn't even as serious as my older sister initially made it out to be. She had lied, and I had played along, even though it was unknowingly, and even though she wasn't entirely at fault. "I'm not homophobic," I replied. "All right," he said, sitting up straighter in his chair and watching me curiously. I spent weeks trying to understand why a stranger would do that to me, and I came to the conclusion that it might have been another case of homophobia. Don't worry, I don't face violence regularly, but there are some people out there with messed up minds. However," he paused and made a shape in the air, "that still doesn't explain why you did it." I swallowed and tightly wrung my hands on my lap. "You hurt my sister," I replied. "Excuse me?" He stopped and got up from his chair to sit on the one in front of me. "My sister, you used her and then threw her under the bus. I understand she has her own issues, but she didn't deserve that. And then she got fired because of you." "Are you talking about Jessie?" he asked. "Yes," he smiled wryly. "Maybe you should first ask her what really happened." "I did. That's what she told me." "Then, Kian, your sister is not honest with you." He stood up and walked across the office with heavy steps. "Your sister, and it's quite hard to imagine her as your sister, does not like hard work. She was first caught stealing office supplies. Then, she was caught in one of her seniors' offices messing with the papers. As if that wasn't enough, she tried to corner me with rather scandalous motives. In the same week, when I did not respond, she blamed me for overpowering her. Thankfully, everything was caught on camera, and I was saved from that shame. She was fired, and then I was too. However, Kian," he turned to me and stopped, "I have not forgiven her. She's going to face charges." I had tears in my eyes. When he stared at me for a minute too long, I couldn't help but let them slip down my cheeks. I was estranged from my family. Mom and Dad did not like me, and when they found out I was gay, they left me alone. Then Jessie was left, and although she did not like me either, she did talk to me whenever she felt like it. Now, if anything that Sullivan had said was true, then I was going to lose her too. "Oh, I'm sorry," I told him. She was the only person I had left in my life, and I just wanted to make sure she was safe. Maybe I felt guilty too, for not being there for her. But sir, I'm sorry." Sullivan sighed. "I will forgive you. Only one way, Kian." And although I did not want to hear the condition, I nodded anyway. "If you help me with my case against your sister, I will let you go." I quickly agreed to it, and it did not shame me one bit. Sullivan then asked me if I wanted to have lunch with him. I was not sure why I agreed to it, but then I walked into the lunchroom with him. My colleagues stared at me in mild shock, and although I was awkward and messy around him, he seemed a lot more relaxed. I really wondered if he had forgiven me for what I had done. When it all ended, I called Jessie. When I told her what I had heard, she hung up and then messaged me that she did not want to have a brother like me, and although that hurt, I did not want to associate myself with her anymore. My past was shameful as it was. I did not want to make it worse. The evening arrived, and so did the nasty weather. It rained heavily for an hour, and I was left stranded on the bus and with wet clothes. Just when I nearly gave up and booked for a cab, a car stopped in front of me. It was a sleek black luxurious car, but I could not tell what brand. It was dark, and everything around me seemed blurry. The windows lowered, and I readied my umbrella in case I needed to defend myself against a potential mean person. Thankfully, it turned out to be Sullivan. "Hey," he shouted over the heavy sound of the rain. "Hop in. It will only get bad from now on. Will that be all right with you?" I shouted back. He nodded and opened the door for me. "Come on, be quick." "Thanks," I said as I shivered. "And sorry," I sucked in my bottom lip. I had wet his seats, and I was sure I was going to be a pain cleaning all of this. "It's all right. Your address?" He pointed to the GPS. "Oh yes," I flushed a shade of red. It was mostly silent in the car, save for the music that played on the radio. I often caught Sullivan staring at me from the corner of my eyes, but did not have the courage to ask him why he was doing that. It was only when my place arrived that I felt the rapid beating of my heart. "Kian," he said before I could leave, "for what it's worth, I understand what you have done is unforgivable, and perhaps it will take time for me to get over that. But that still does not make you a bad person. Your heart was in the right place." He rubbed the thumb over the steering wheel, but did not take his eyes away from me. For some reason, I kind of felt safe with him at this moment, and I strangely hoped that he did too. But when I returned home, I knew it was a hopeless wish. I had acted like a bully, and I knew I would be condemned to face the consequences for it. For what it was worth, I was ready to face that. That night, I cried into the pillow like a helpless and hapless baby. Weirdly, out of all the things I had expected, I hadn't expected what soon came into being. For one, Sullivan seemed intent on filing charges against Jessie, and he pulled that as well. In court, I sat by Sullivan's side and against Jessie's. Unfortunately, my parents were present there too, and they seemed disappointed in me. I couldn't tell why that was. This was no mistake of mine, but I knew I did not have the energy in me to fight them anymore. I accepted their venom, and the fact that my relationship with them would never recover. And, well, that was not news to me. I returned to my work as Sullivan had arranged. We ate lunch together. I wasn't sure why he wanted that, but sometimes he seemed just as lonely as I felt. The words around the office about our apparent closeness had started spreading wildly, but no one was brave enough to question Sullivan Redmond about it. But that wasn't enough. Sullivan often proposed to drive me home. He claimed my place was on his way home, and it made sense. 2 weeks after the court case and 5 weeks after I first saw him in the office, I invited Sullivan to my home. I did that out of politeness, for it only seemed reasonable to invite him in for some coffee on such a cold day. He seemed glad that I had done that and parked his car in front of my place. "It's been time," he said, "since someone invited me over." "Oh," I said, and welcomed him in. That's news. Sullivan was a handsome rich man, so him confessing that he did not get invited out a lot was surprising. "Would you like some water?" I asked. "Yes, please." He followed after me and looked around the place. "You have a very cozy place." He rubbed his hand on the wall and nodded his head in approval. "It's a very nice home, Kian." "Thanks," I answered, and gave him a glass of water. He sipped on his water and leaned against the doorway. I stood in front of him with my hands crossed behind my back. It was silent once again. Fortunately, it did not feel awkward. "Would you like a change of clothes?" "I'm sure your clothes will not fit me," he answered and chuckled. "But no, Kian, I think I will have to leave soon. Family dinner." "Oh, nice. I didn't remember the last time I ate with my family. Probably in my teenage years. I had to take a wild guess." "You live alone?" he asked, and I nodded as I put some water in the kettle. If he had to leave early, I was not going to hold him. Family duties mattered in the families where love was present. Even though I did not have a loving family, I knew I would not leave a chance to meet them. "Doesn't it get boring?" I shrugged. A habit that I had recently picked up. I have learned to live with it. "Do you know, you're bad at tying a knot," he suddenly began. "Huh?" I asked and turned to find him closer than before. There was still some decent distance between us, but now I had to crane my neck to look him in the face. Ours was the same height difference that I had observed between my ex-boyfriend and me, except he was a grouchy man. It was very easy for me to open the knot that day in the washroom. I was more baffled and amused at your attempt than upset, to be honest. Even though, yes, that does not make you any less guilty of your crime. I get it. It was bad. The knot and, everything. I turned towards the kettle to see if the water had started boiling. I switched it off and then grabbed 2 cups from the cabinet. "Would you like sugar?" "Yes, please." His voice was nearer than ever. I was immediately reminded of that stupid cursed day in that dirty washroom. Even without him doing anything, I could recall the way he had been breathing that day. My hands trembled as I stirred the coffee powder in our cups. I poured milk in each one and turned to give him his cup of coffee. Anything to get out of the situation that made me want to kiss him. But Sullivan had a different thing in his mind, because the moment I turned, he dipped his head a little and searched for my eyes. When I caught his eyes, he told me in a soft voice that he still recalled the kiss we had shared that day. And then, "Can I kiss you, Kian?" I immediately wanted to say yes, but I still had some self-respect left in me. But he seemed to notice what I felt and wanted because he carefully grabbed the cup from my hands and placed it on the counter. Then, he asked me again, and well, I said yes. Because even though I did not know where we were and what we meant for each other, I still wanted to kiss him. Surprisingly, the kiss felt even better than that day. And with shame, I mourned that day once again. Surprisingly, it seemed like a smooth sail from that day onwards. In the office, we maintained professionalism, and outside it, we hung out. A few colleagues of mine did seem to notice this change in our behaviors, but they still did not have the courage to say anything. The week after the kiss, I first told him about my situation with my family. It was the first time I had discussed it with anyone outside my family, but at least Sullivan seemed keen to hear me out. Dad has always been abusive towards me, but when they found me kissing a guy, and that was an accident, they immediately told me that they can't stand me. I was in my final year of high school, so that was a big shock. I rubbed my hands on my thighs with some shame. That's why I have poor grades, but then Jessie seemed chill about it. She was still not cool with me being gay, but she wasn't as mean as my parents were. I thought I would die with her by my side, but then stuff happened, and now none of them want to talk to me. If it makes it any better, my dad had a similar position, but then he doesn't have anyone else to handle the business after him, so we cracked a deal of some sort. When I marry my boyfriend, I will have to find a surrogate. It's mostly for the sake of the family business than anything. That's what it is. He looked at me. Family dinners are now a poor excuse to mend our relationship. Are they awkward? I asked a little curiously. Kind of. I mean, I'm their only child, so they cannot really be upset at me, you know? So although not awkward, I still do not want to attend them. At least you still have a family. His smile dropped for a millisecond before he asked if I wanted to come to one of the family dinners. I told him that would be weird. I was merely one of his employees. And honestly, that was the truth. There was nothing serious going on between us. We kissed, sure, but we had a weird past, and I did not know if he had moved past that. And I did not consider myself worth it for him to do so. Strangely, when he did not defend my theory, I felt sorry for myself. Maybe all my projections about myself and my situationship with Sullivan were right. When the silence after that seemed overbearing, I brought his attention towards the most glaring worries in my company. The company was cutting down on the operating cost. Fortunately, it had also decided to let go of some of the employees. 50 of us were already fired, and I was worried my chance was close too. And I did not want to lose this job. I didn't really have the qualifications to find another job. Sullivan rubbed the back of my hand. "Not you," he said. "You work great." I smiled gratefully at that. If I lost this job, I literally would not have anything left on me. And I was sure if that happened, I was going to do something to myself. During one of our meetings outside the office hours, I asked him a question. "Why were you working for another company when you have a perfectly functioning company here?" Sullivan grinned. "I just wanted to stay away from my family." "Oh, really?" "I mean, that was one of the reasons." He paused the movie and turned to me. "But besides that, obviously, I wanted to gain some experience. I knew once I would return to the company, I would have to handle a lot." "So, escapism, in a way?" I asked and rolled over the bed to look at him. My sister ruined it. Now we cannot be hung up on that. It was Sunday and past noon. He grabbed the blankets and asked if I wanted to take a nap. And honestly, who was I to deny that? Things aren't that bad, honestly, and I'm glad to hear that. I answered and hugged him. Sullivan gave the best hugs, and I intended to make full use of them. The company announced that because of the street protests, we were allowed to leave an hour early. One of the colleagues confirmed that the roads were blocked by the protesters, and it would surely take some time for the police to get them off the roads. I immediately looked at Sullivan's cabin. He seemed to be working on something, but as if he could feel my eyes on him, he looked up and caught my eyes. He gave a little wave, and I immediately looked around to see if anyone had seen, but thankfully everyone was busy with their own stuff and did not seem to notice what we were up to. I messaged him and asked him if he was coming. He asked me to wait 10 minutes. As my colleagues walked past me and awkwardly asked when I was going to leave, I gave them flimsy excuses. They did not seem to accept them, but moved on. 20 minutes later, Sullivan walked out of the office, rubbed his eyes, and muttered softly under his breath. I asked him what it was, and he replied he was swearing. I flushed in embarrassment and followed him out of the building. "I'm going out for a coffee. Would you like to come?" he asked. These days, I left the office with him in his car, so I told him I didn't mind. He nodded and we walked to the nearest local cafe. He ordered black coffee for himself and 2 pastries for me. My mouth watered at the sight of them. They looked delicious. When I tried to pay, he insisted he would pay. We sat in the far end of the cafe. While talking and eating, we pulled our chairs together. In between, he suddenly brought up his hand close to my face. I immediately sputtered and coughed out some pastries. Thankfully, nothing landed on Sullivan, but he still grinned. "Jesus," he said. "You're one messy eater." He handed me some napkins and helped me clean my clothes and face. I furiously apologized despite my stuttering breath and shaky voice. I was sure my face was tomato red, and to think we had kissed so many times, he said. "There's something in your hair. Sorry, I should have first asked." No, I just overreacted." "You did not, but let me." He brought his hand to my hair and showed me the small leaf he had caught. A leaf? It's so small. It looked like a beetle. "Oh," I said and internally cringed. Anything but those monsters. "Finish your stuff. Do you like playing games?" he asked. "Games?" "Yep," he said, and popped to the P. "Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo. You have all of them?" I asked in amazement. "And more," he whispered and grinned at me. "Yes, then." But obviously we weren't going to spend the entire evening and night playing games. At some point, we started kissing. It started from there and eventually reached where we were right now. He had draped himself over me, and we were still fully clothed and in our work outfits, but he was now telling me stories of his family affairs. They were funny, but he was heavy, so when I told him that, he turned us around. Now, although I was sitting on top of him, I was glad he worked out. I was not heavy, but I was a fully grown man. "I'm not averse to the idea of being tied down, by the way," he suddenly said, with the softest of his teasing grins. I swallowed and blushed, but quickly changed the subject. I was not ready yet, and he seemed to get the idea quickly. He grabbed his phone from the table to dispel the awkwardness I imagined around us, and asked me what I wanted to eat. I do not suppose either of us want to eat, so this is the best option. What do you say? Anything? Oh, come on. Really, I don't mind. Okay, he dragged out the word. Then it's going to be a surprise. But one dessert, please. He laughed and showed me his phone. He had already added my favorite dessert. Looking at him as he decided our surprise menu, I couldn't help but think how this story started. My sister had lied to me about him, and this thing between us shouldn't have been possible. But against all odds, here we were. Oh, by the way, he suddenly said, if you'd like, my family is setting up another family dinner. We can go together. Oh, I replied. Only if you want, that is. Conclusion. I did not join him for the family dinner this time, but I did so some weeks later. His parents were just like he had said they were. They had their own issues, but they were not unkind. My relationship with Sullivan got better with time. Jessie tried to contact me for some help, but she did not seem regretful about what she had done. After a brief confrontation with her, I finally ended things with her. My parents still did not seem very keen on moving on, and I did not want to force them into their process, so I let it be. The end. Sullivan and Kian had to navigate the troubles in their relationship to reach where they did. It sure took them some time. What troubles did you deal with to stay by your loved one's side? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.